They were more than machines. They were the instruments of a nation at war. From the frozen skies over the Pacific to the flak-filled corridors above Nazi Germany, American aircraft carried the fight to the enemy on every front. Fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, flying boats, transport aircraft, and ground attack machines. Each one built for a purpose, each one flown by men who knew the odds. Some of these aircraft were already aging when the war began. Others arrived just in time to turn the tide. A few became legends that the world still remembers today. Together, they formed the most powerful air force the world had ever seen. These are every U.S. aircraft used in World War II. First up, fighters. P-40 Warhawk. One of the most recognizable American fighters of the early war, the P-40 was already in service when Pearl Harbor was attacked. It was not the fastest or most agile fighter in the sky, but in the hands of skilled pilots, including the famous Flying Tigers. It proved capable and deadly. P-36 Hawk. The predecessor to the P-40, the P-36, was already being phased out when the war began. It still saw combat in the opening hours of Pearl Harbor, one of the few American fighters to actually get airborne that morning. P-38 Lightning. With its distinctive twin-boom design, the P-38 became one of the most versatile American fighters of the war. It excelled at long-range escort, interception, and ground attack. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto was killed when P-38S ambushed his transport over the Pacific. P-39 Airacobra. Unusual for its mid-mounted engine and car-style door, the P-39 struggled at high altitude but found its best use in low-level combat. The Soviet Union received thousands through Lend-Lease and used them with great effectiveness on the Eastern Front. P-47 Thunderbolt. Massive, powerful, and nearly impossible to destroy, the P-47 earned a fierce reputation as both a fighter and a ground attack platform. Its radial engine could absorb extraordinary punishment and still bring pilots home. It dominated over Europe and the Pacific alike. P-51 Mustang. Perhaps the single most important fighter of the war. With long-range drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Its arrival over Europe in late 1943 changed the strategic bombing campaign overnight. Fast, agile, and deadly, it remains one of the greatest fighter aircraft ever built. F-4F Wildcat. The primary U.S. Navy carrier fighter at the start of the Pacific War. It was outperformed by the Japanese Zero in many respects, but Wildcat pilots used tactics like the Thok weave to survive and fight back. It held the line until better aircraft arrived. F-6F Hellcat. Designed specifically to defeat the Zero, the Hellcat became the dominant carrier fighter of the Pacific War. It was fast, tough, and heavily armed. Hellcat pilots achieved an astounding kill ratio against Japanese opposition. F-4U Corsair. Powerful and fast, the Corsair initially struggled with carrier operations but became one of the most feared fighters in the Pacific. Marines flew it from island airstrips with devastating effect. Japanese pilots feared its distinctive bent-wing silhouette. P-61 Black Widow. America's first purpose-built night fighter. The P-61 was large, radar-equipped, and designed to hunt in the dark. Its crew worked together to find and destroy enemy aircraft that other fighters could not pursue after sunset. P-63 King Cobra. An improved development of the P-39, the King Cobra served primarily through Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. American units used it mainly for training and specialized roles rather than frontline combat. P-80 Shooting Star. America's first operational jet fighter arrived just too late to see significant combat in World War II. A handful reached Europe before the war ended, but the Shooting Star pointed directly toward the jet age that would follow. Now, bombers. B-17 Flying Fortress. Few aircraft in history carry a legacy as powerful as the B-17. Flying in tight defensive formations over occupied Europe, B-17 crews faced flak and fighters on every mission. Heavily armed and surprisingly durable, it became the backbone of the 8th Air Force's strategic campaign against Germany. B-24 Liberator. Built in greater numbers than any other American aircraft of the war, the B-24 served on every front. Faster and longer range than the B-17, it was also considered harder to fly. Crews had fierce opinions about it, but its range made it essential for long Pacific missions and the famous low-level Ploesti raid. B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of the war. Pressurized, heavily armed, and capable of reaching Japan from distant Pacific islands. The B-29 conducted the strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. 2 of them ended the war. B-25 Mitchell. Medium, fast, and highly adaptable, the B-25 served on every front. It became internationally famous when 16 of them launched from the deck of USS Hornet and struck Tokyo in the Doolittle Raid of April 1942. B-26 Marauder. Early in the war, the Marauder's demanding handling earned it a brutal nickname among pilots. Once crews mastered it, however, it became one of the most effective medium bombers in the European theater, finishing the war with the lowest loss rate of any American bomber. A-20 Havoc. Fast and aggressive, the A-20 excelled at low-level attack and light bombing. It served in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, often striking targets that heavier bombers could not approach. A-26 Invader. Introduced late in the war, the A-26 was fast, hard-hitting, and highly capable. It arrived in time to see combat in both Europe and the Pacific, and it proved so effective that it remained in frontline service for decades after the war ended. SBD Dauntless, a carrier-based dive bomber that changed the course of the Pacific War. At the Battle of Midway, Dauntless crews sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single morning. One of the most decisive moments in naval aviation history. TBF Avenger. The primary torpedo bomber of the U.S. Navy, the Avenger was large, dependable, and capable. It served throughout the Pacific Campaign, striking ships, submarines, and shore installations. A young George H.W. Bush flew one. SB-2C Helldiver. The replacement for the Dauntless, the Helldiver had a troubled development but eventually became the standard carrier dive bomber for the later Pacific campaigns. It delivered devastating results against the Japanese fleet. Next, transport and cargo aircraft. He-47 Skytrain. If any single aircraft kept the Allied war effort moving, it was the C-47. It dropped paratroopers over Normandy and the Netherlands, supplied forces across the Pacific, and flew the hump route over the Himalayas into China. Reliable, rugged, and essential, it was everywhere the war demanded. He-54 Skymaster. A 4-engine long-range transport, the C-54 served as the primary strategic airlift aircraft for the United States. It carried commanders, diplomats, and critical cargo across oceans. President Roosevelt flew in a modified version called the Sacred Cow, Ki-46 Commando. Larger than the C-47 and better suited for high-altitude operations, the C-46 became the aircraft of choice for flying the hump route over the Himalayas. Its capacity and ceiling made it indispensable in that punishing environment. Ki-87 Liberator Express. The transport version of the B-24, it shared the bomber's long range and was used for intercontinental cargo and passenger missions across the Atlantic and Pacific. Ki-69 Constellation. One of the most elegant aircraft of its era, the Constellation entered military service late in the war as a long-range transport. Its distinctive triple tail and graceful fuselage made it unmistakable. Now to patrol and maritime aircraft. PBY Catalina. One of the most important patrol aircraft of the war, the Catalina conducted long-range ocean patrols, submarine hunts, and rescue missions across the Pacific and Atlantic. Its endurance was extraordinary, and its crews used it to save the lives of downed airmen across vast stretches of open ocean. PB-4Y Liberator Privateer. A naval development of the B-24, these patrol bombers hunted submarines and enemy shipping across the Atlantic and Pacific. Their range made them ideal for covering the vast ocean areas where U-boats operated. PBM Mariner. A large flying boat that served alongside the Catalina in patrol and maritime reconnaissance roles. It offered greater capacity and range for extended ocean operations. OS-2U Kingfisher. A small float plane used for observation and rescue from battleships and cruisers. Its ability to land on the open ocean to retrieve downed airmen made it one of the most valued aircraft in the fleet. Moving on to observation and liaison aircraft. L-4 Grasshopper. Based on the civilian Piper Cub, the L-4 became one of the most widely used liaison and artillery observation aircraft of the war. Small, quiet, and easy to operate from improvised strips, it gave ground commanders eyes over the battlefield that they had never had before. L-5 Sentinel. Slightly larger and more capable than the L-4, the Sentinel served in observation, liaison, and medical evacuation roles. In the Pacific and Burma, its ability to land in very short spaces made it invaluable. O-52 Owl. Designed for observation before the war began, the O-52 was largely obsolete by the time combat started. It served in limited roles while simpler and more practical aircraft like the L-4 took over the battlefield observation mission. Now to training aircraft. AT-6 Texan, the most important advanced trainer of the American war effort. Hundreds of thousands of pilots passed through the Texan before flying combat aircraft. It was demanding enough to prepare pilots for the real thing, and its distinctive sound made it instantly recognizable over training fields across America. PT-17 Stearman, the classic biplane trainer that most American pilots flew first. Its open cockpit and honest handling characteristics gave new aviators their foundation before they moved on to faster and more complex aircraft. BT-13 Valiant, the intermediate step between the Stearman and the Texan, the Valiant introduced student pilots to more powerful aircraft with enclosed cockpits. Its loud engine earned it the nickname the Vultee Vibrator. Finally, experimental and special-purpose aircraft. XB-35 Flying Wing. Northrop's radical flying wing bomber represented a completely different approach to aircraft design. It flew experimentally but never reached combat service. Its concept pointed directly toward the stealth bombers that would come decades later. XP-55 Ascender, a pusher configuration experimental fighter with an unusual rear-mounted propeller. It explored new ideas in fighter design but did not advance beyond the experimental stage. GB-1 Glide Bomb. An early attempt at a guided weapon, the GB-1 gave bombers the ability to release weapons and glide them toward targets from a distance. It represented the beginning of ideas that would eventually become precision-guided munitions.